Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Seed Speaks. My name is Allie Roden, and I'm the digital media producer here at Seed World Group. Today, I am absolutely thrilled to be your host. Last week on Seed Speaks, you heard two specialists discuss how consumer trends affect ag policy. This week, we're addressing the myths surrounding ugly produce, the role the Misfits play in food loss, and how they impact consumer decisions. To help us learn more, we've got two fantastic panelists joining us. Yann Cornil, Associate Professor of Marketing at the University of British Columbia, and Jackie Suggitt, Director of Capital, Innovation, and Engagement at ReFed. Thanks so much to both of you for joining us today. So let's start with some introductions. Can you tell us more about yourself, Yann?
Sure. So first, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to discuss with you and share some of the results of my research. So my name is Yann Cornil. I'm from France, and I'm an associate professor of marketing and behavioral science at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, in Canada. And most of my research is on food. And lately, I've worked on food waste and how to label ugly produce with cosmetic defects. And I'm very happy to discuss about it today.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Jackie, do you want to tell us more about yourself and your position at ReFed?
Sure. Thank you, Allie. Also really excited to be here. So for those who don't know, ReFed is a nonprofit in the US focused on food waste reduction. We do a lot of our work is centered on data and improving the data around food waste. We also work at driving catalytic capital into this space and then ultimately on supporting players across the supply chain and implementing solutions. I specifically largely work with our food businesses on the work that they do, as well as some of our partnerships across the country to be implementing those solutions.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. So let's go ahead and dive in. First off, let's start with a general question. And this can be for either of you, whoever wants to speak first, and then we can add any other comments. So what makes produce ugly or imperfect, and what are the typical grocery store requirements that a piece of produce must meet?
Sure, I'm happy to start off, and I know Yann can likely add some detail to this, but yeah, ugly or imperfect produce is really simply just that which doesn't meet the quote unquote standard, and I use air quotes on that a little bit, that stores set or that we as consumers would expect to see in our shopping experience. So those specifications can be anything from color, size, shape, visual imperfections. So carrot needs to have a single straight stem of X inches long. Apples need to be a certain color depending on the variety, X inches in diameter, perfectly round, etc. So they vary by product type, but they're basically the rules that are set on what stores can purchase and put on their shelves.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to this, but indeed, the type of imperfections is purely cosmetic, purely aesthetic, and usually it's never going to lead to any impact on safety. There's no disease, there's no damage, there's nothing that should impact the taste, the nutritional quality, or even the conservation, but purely the shape, the color, some brown spots, for instance, that should have no impact other than cosmetic.
And what causes those standards to be so strict cosmetically?
I can start with that. So it's everyone, all the stakeholders had those expectations. Of course, the industrials, the distributors, and the consumers themselves. And if you ask the distributors, if you ask supermarket and grocery store managers, they will say, "Oh, that's because of the consumers. The consumers will not purchase produce that is cosmetically unpleasing," for instance. So the inferences that the distributors draw on consumers' expectations is only amplifying the issue. So if there is anything to do in terms of education, it should be education not only to consumers, but also to the other stakeholders, the distributors, the industrials, that maybe consumers themselves might be ready to purchase ugly produce. And perhaps with certain marketing techniques like labeling, we will discuss about that later, maybe consumers themselves might not be so strict in terms of their expectations of the produce they want to purchase.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. I think when I was thinking about this question, it is almost a bit of a chicken and an egg, where retailers, as you said, retailers base their specifications on consumer preferences and how consumers spend their dollars. And let's be honest, when we go into the store to the produce bin, we often do look for, the best products within that bin. However, our expectations are also reaffirmed then by what we see in stores. If we're only seeing perfect produce, then that is what we expect. And to Yann's point, I think we could see that consumers are willing to expand what they would qualify as acceptable to purchase if that variety was offered in stores.
Awesome. And Yann, I'm going to gear this question towards you because I know you've done a lot of research on this. So right now, what are the most recent consumer trends when purchasing ugly produce?
So what we see a lot on the market is boxes, like boxes that are delivered directly to consumers, and some of those small or medium companies that sell boxes directly sourced from the farmers, but some also farm from the industrials. And they usually work on a subscription-based model. When you're a small company, it can be, in terms of profitability, pretty interesting. So now I don't know exactly how they are doing all those subscription boxes of like farm-to-table produce. I see them popping up quite a lot, and some of them disappear quite quickly. So it's definitely not a mature market, but it's something we observe a lot. And also, even among the large distributors, pretty much all of them, you can like Walmart, Whole Foods, in Canada, Loblaw or No Frills, all of them have tried at some point, at different points in time, to have like batches of ugly produce with different forms of labeling, different forms of communication to consumers. But it's not been particularly successful. I know that Walmart and Whole Foods like stopped the operation after a few months. So there's still a lot to learn about how to market this type of produce.
And going into that a bit more, I know you just touched on it, but overall, what role does food marketing play, and how does that marketing increase the likelihood of consumers to actually purchase those ugly produce products?
So a huge role. So marketing can rely on like nudges, like small interventions that can completely change consumers' perceptions and behavior. And like semantics work, semantics matter, like the type of words that marketers use in order to describe this produce. So I'd like to credit Sid Mukherjee, a PhD student at the University of British Columbia, as well as Joey Hogue, with whom I collaborated on the research I'm going to discuss during this program. And so one of the things we did is that we surveyed 52 grocery store and supermarket managers and asked them and asked them how they thought such ugly produce should be labeled. And there was a vast heterogeneity, so they didn't really know. And when we looked at the different distributors that have labeled ugly produce in a specific way, there was also a lot of heterogeneity. Like a lot of them called them imperfect. Some of them did some puns, some play on word, like produce with personality or I'm perfect. Interestingly, very few used the word ugly, maybe because I don't know, it has some negative connotations. But then we tried them. We did some experiments in which we tried different labels for a produce in order to find out which one was the most successful. And the one that was the most successful was actually the least popular one. It was the ugly label. So labeling produce ugly increases purchase intentions compared to no labeling at all, or compared to an imperfect labeling or produce with personality. So everything that seems to try to mitigate the effect or trying to use not too strong words doesn't seem to be so successful, and the word ugly seems to be quite impactful in terms of purchase intentions. There's also the question of price discounts. So what we've seen is like heavy price discounts on ugly produce. In fact, what we find in our research is that the price discount should not be too steep. It should be like less than 20%. And the reason is that you don't want to send mixed signals to consumers, because consumers already expect ugly produce to be of lower quality. So if you reinforce the signal of low quality with a steep discount, consumers will just not purchase the produce. They will prefer to pay a bit more to have the produce that really sends signals of quality in terms of price and in terms of cosmetic appeal.
Awesome. Yeah, that's so interesting. And I'm going to switch gears a little bit to the food waste side of things. And Jackie, I'll have you answer this one. So one claim surrounding ugly produce is that the disposal of that imperfect produce by farms before reaching stores is the greatest contributor to food waste. So do you believe this is true? And if not, what is the greatest contributor or the multiple contributors to this?
Yeah, well, the short answer is there are many, many, many contributors to food waste, but this is definitely on the list. So one of the things that we do at ReFed is we model out, I think we're a little over 40 now, different solutions to food waste at various points in the supply chain. So if we look back to on-farm and the solution set that's relevant for food waste that is produced on-farm, the largest opportunity from a tonnage perspective is what we call imperfect and surplus produce channels. So imperfect produce is a part of that, but it would also include general surplus from the growing season. Another related solution is one that we call buyer spec expansion. So this is actually looking further up the supply chain of people who are buying that produce and loosening those specifications that Yann and I both mentioned at the beginning of this panel. So both of those solutions are in the top 5, kind of any way you cut the metrics. So I mentioned by tonnage, but if you change that to net financial benefit or GHG emission reductions, water use, et cetera, one or both of those two solutions are pretty consistently within the top 5.
Awesome. And I'm going to take it a step further too there's a lot of these companies that are selling these misfit products that are marketing the waste of the misfit products as the biggest factor. So in your opinion, a tricky question, do you think that these companies are hurting or helping more? And if you think they're hurting, what can they change to actually make a difference and drive through that mission that they're putting out?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. I actually saw one pop up in the chat that I think is somewhat related about, those ugly produce boxes. Do they actually help minimize food waste? Yann probably actually has better numbers on this from me on the marketing side, but I'd say, there's 2 questions to ask here. One is it reducing food waste in a specific node in the supply chain? So if we were to change buyer specifications, for example, and we said, okay, carrots with 2 stems are now acceptable, we could be reducing food waste on farm by allowing more of that product to get harvested and enter into the supply chain. But that doesn't answer the question, does it reduce food waste? Because now as consumers or as retailers, is it actually being consumed? So if I as a retailer now carry a 2-stemmed carrot, can I sell it? If not, am I throwing it away? If I can sell it and I as a consumer buy it and take it in my home, am I eating it or am I ultimately throwing it away? And so we need to be careful that we aren't just shifting the waste to a different place in the supply chain, but that we're finding solutions that either, ideally end up with that food being consumed at the end of the day. So there is definitely opportunity on behalf of retailers and every player in the supply chain to be reducing this waste. I think finding creative markets for it, whether it is marketed as ugly produce or not, it's just kind of introduced into the standard offering to consumers. There is definitely a waste stream here that we can be reducing.
Awesome. Yeah, go ahead, Yann.
Yeah, to add to that, I think some of these subscription boxes came under fire because they come with a lot of claims, a lot of what we call virtue signals, right? They have claims of contributing positively to society, to the environment by selling ugly produce and reducing waste. But at the same time, a lot of them were criticized for sourcing sourcing their produce from industrial scale producers and not from the farmers, right? And we know that it's at the level of the farmers that there's a lot of waste because farmers expect the industry, the distributors and the consumers not to purchase or not to want those ugly produce. So it's really a matter of who collaborates with whom, what does the supply chain look like, can these small actors in the distribution sectors, the small actors with the subscription boxes, collaborate directly with the farmers? What does it mean for their margins? What does it mean for their market powers? It's a whole ecosystem, a whole industry here with broader question than just the labeling of ugly produce here.
Yeah, 100%. And I want to bring in another audience question from Ashley Robinson. So how much does how we were raised play into the consumer preferences? And are we buying pretty produce because that's how our parents taught us to shop for quality food?
Go ahead, Yann, I'll let you start.
I think that it's an interesting question. So upbringing, yes. At the same time, I think that produce has become more and more cosmetically pleasing over time, right? Because of progress in agriculture, progress in technology, also the use of chemicals, the use of pesticides, the use of GMOs as well. So I think over time we've been accustomed, habituated to produce that is more and more pleasing. And like we can even talk a little bit about psychology here. There is something quite fundamental in human psychology in which we like what's prototypical, right? And we feel awkward, we feel ill at ease when we see something which deviates from a prototypical shape, for something that should look like an apple or should look like a carrot. So if there's an anomaly in the shape of the apple or the carrot, we will tend to have this negative reaction, right? And maybe emotions of disgust or fear that's not particularly conducive of purchase intentions. So I think it goes even deeper than what we are used to in our educations.
Yeah, I would agree with that and say, it's reinforced everywhere, right? In media and what we actually see available in the stores, in what we grew up with. So I think that's absolutely a piece of the puzzle, along with many other pieces. And what Yann mentioned about that, I think goes to a little bit to why it's hard to see sometimes it's hard to see successful implementations of this within a retail setting, because like he said, we are uncomfortable with something that is not the prototype and not the norm. And so when you have a single retailer or a single store introduce something that is unusual, right, an ugly item, it affects perceived quality, perceived freshness, perceived value, perceived taste. None of that is, of course, true, but that is how our human minds work. So we call it first mover disadvantage, where those who are implementing these solutions first can actually see disadvantages in their sales, because that's not the norm across their peers. I can go to a different store and find all the produce looking perfect, and that could be a perception in my mind of higher quality. So that first mover disadvantage can be a hindrance into implementing solutions like this.
Awesome. And I'm going to open the floor for a pretty general question. So we've talked about a few misconceptions surrounding ugly produce. Personally, what are some misconceptions that you guys have seen about ugly produce, and how would you address those claims?
Yeah, I think we've kind of touched on a few already. Yann mentioned the nutritional side, the value side. All of that is not true. Taste and nutrition are not affected by the cosmetic appearance. The other one I hear sometimes, just because of where we sit on implementing all these various solutions to food waste, is, okay, you have all this ugly produce. Why don't you just go can it all? Or we call it value added processing, right? To get it into the supply chain. And that actually is a very valuable solution to food waste in many scenarios. But I think what consumers don't always understand is, because our agricultural system has grown and developed and matured so much in the past century or half century, we have very different varieties that don't allow us to do that. So not all peaches can be canned, for example, right? So that is a viable solution, but it's not quite as simple necessarily as just go can it all. That's one that I hear fairly often in the space that we're in.
Yeah, so to add to this, so totally agree. And in terms of consumer inferences, what we find in the data is, yes, there is an expectation of lower nutritional quality when the produce is cosmetically unpleasing, but especially taste, especially the expectations about taste that is impacted by the visual appeal of the produce. The only attribute that seems to benefit from ugliness is the perception of naturality. And consumers do have these expectations, which are not wrong. They are pretty right in terms of expectation. They expect ugly produce to be more natural, to be more organic, maybe. And it's true that organic foods, organic produce, because they don't use the chemicals and the pesticides, they tend to have like different shapes. They tend to have more natural variations in the colors, the shapes, or maybe some small spots on it. And of course, it doesn't mean that they are lower in nutritional quality or in taste. In fact, there is even research suggesting that organic produce tend to have higher nutritional quality than non-organic produce.
And to wrap it up with my final question, why are these misconceptions surrounding ugly produce so harmful?
Great. Yeah, I can start. And I know it's probably not best practice to like rattle off a bunch of numbers in a presentation, but let me just share a couple from the modeling that we've done. So I mentioned those two solutions earlier about expanding buyer specifications and having imperfect and surplus produce channels. So if you look at those two solutions combined, let me just share a couple of the metrics for you that we look at when we model out these food waste solutions. So combined, these are annual metrics. If we were to implement these solutions fully, we're looking at $7.5 billion in net economic benefit. We're looking at 3.5 million tons of food waste diverted every year. We're looking at 325,000 metric tons of CO2 and about 100 billion gallons of water. So if you do the opposite of all that, that's the risk, right? If we're not addressing these issues, that's kind of what's on the table for what's currently being lost, both in tonnage value and from an environmental perspective. So huge opportunity here.
I also had statistics, but I'm not going to give them. But it's true. There's also a contribution to climate change. In terms, meat is a greater culprit in terms of contribution to climate change. But it's true that the waste of produce that are left to decompose in the landfill, the impact on water as well is pretty huge. So it does have a stronger environmental impact. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, that's all the time we have today, everyone. Thank you so much, Yann and Jackie, for joining us. I hope our audience brought something home with them because I know I learned a ton during this awesome discussion. If you liked this topic, make sure to tune in next week, where my colleague Alex Martin is talking about the misconceptions surrounding biologicals. See you all.